Therefore, Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these have been written so that you might believe, and that by believing you may have life in his name. John 20, 30, and 31. There we see the purpose of the fourth gospel. In the first half of the book, there are some 7 indicators, signals, object lessons that point beyond the event itself to some truth about Jesus' identity, some proof, and some verification of his claims. And today we begin investigating each of these signs of life with the intent that after we place ourselves on the scene and we hear and witness and feel and experience as much as we can what they did, we too will believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, and we will have life in his name. What a great day we experienced yesterday as some 18 of us, not all pictured here, took part in the first recent local Keller mission effort. A number of people gathered to pack bags that we could take door to door, and then we went out on the highway 1709 wearing our orange vests, and there we took bags and we picked up garbage. What a thrill it was to have trash talk with brothers and sisters. But it got better than that. We exchanged our junk for other bags filled with messages about the gospel of Christ. And then we went 2 by 2 out into the neighborhood. And some of us knocked doors, others just left the bags on the door, so that many are aware now of the wonderful saving message that Jesus Christ brings life. And then we received other bags that had hymnals in them, and we went to Heritage Place, and there we sang with the residents and had a wonderful time of fellowship and worship. And Spencer, in his continued time of involvement with us, will help put together these events on a monthly basis. If you could not take part yesterday, we hope you will in the future. But this idea of turning trash in and receiving good news in different bags might relate in a way to what happened in Cana of Galilee, as Gary has just read in John chapter 2. Here were these 6 stone water pots, and the Jews had used them over and over and over again for a routine, a ritual, something they did by rote, put water in them, pour the water out, and then somehow they thought this brought them some purification, at least on the outside, so that they could come into the presence of God. Jesus transformed the water that was poured into those old stone pots into something fresh and invigorating and life-giving, better than the head waiter had ever tasted. And there's a message there for you and for me that Jesus can take what's stale, what's tired, what's worn out, and if we'll pour it into those jars, he can bring out of those same jars life and hope and forgiveness and a purpose. This first of 7 signs takes us to Cana of Galilee, an area just a little over 8 miles northeast of Nazareth. You can see the scene there around the Sea of Galilee where Jesus began a large part of his ministry with the fishermen. As you know, he was raised in Nazareth after being born south in Bethlehem of Judea. And then when he was rejected in Nazareth, he made his base of operations, if you will, Capernaum. It's mentioned here in John 2 and verse 12. But we see Bethsaida and all of these towns around that body of water. Archaeologists have made some exciting discoveries in a place called Khirbet Cana, where there was a thriving Jewish village between the 300s BC and the 300s AD, no longer in existence. There, a network of tunnels used for early Christian worship, marked with crosses and the words Lord Jesus. And there's an altar there and the remains of a stone vessel. They've also found an area where the jars might have been produced that were present on that occasion. Here you can see Cana sort of in the distance. As you come closer, look what a beautiful area this was. And then that fertile plain, you come to the excavations. And here are the rocks that have been uncovered. And the idea that scientists and scholars and experts have gone in and they've verified once again this place, most likely the scene where Jesus performed this first of his signs. And there you can see where a construction has been made and they could enter into these various tunnels. Rena in modern-day Israel is the location of another discovery where ancient mugs and ceramics and stone implements were likely made. And so the case has been presented that it was here that those stone jars might have been constructed that are noted in John chapter 2. Here are some stone jars found in various areas of Israel. And yet the size mentioned in John 2 would suggest something much larger, perhaps like this, 20 or 30 gallons each. In John 2, people ask, what kind of wine did Jesus make? And you're familiar, I'm sure, with the different questions that have been raised, and I've discussed that from this pulpit before. I'm not going to take a lot of time with it this morning, except just to note it's very clear from historical sources that in the first century, the standard beverage was wine diluted with water so that one could quench his thirst without becoming intoxicated. The common ratio was 5 parts water to 1 part of wine. Sometimes it was as much as 10 parts water. Some have looked at John 2 and verse 11 and the reference to people having drunk freely and then you bring the best wine to suggest that the people at the wedding were drunk and then Jesus made them more drunk by bringing something intoxicating on top of what they had already consumed. That's not thinkable or reasonable to you and to me because of what the Bible says about drunkenness. And so it seems most likely, as noted in this article, Wine Drinking in New Testament Times, that something else was the case. It wasn't necessarily unfermented grape juice, though it could have been because the Greek word for wine, oinos, refers to what comes from the grape at any stage. It can be grape juice, it can be partially fermented, it can be fully fermented. But it's not necessarily that. It could be, much more likely, this weakened form so that people could quench their thirst and be part of that celebration without becoming intoxicated. So I put 2 new posts. One is this article that documents that fact, and the other is from Ann Landers. Don't you love Ann Landers? 1993, The Most Clever Thief, if you'd like to take a look at that. But I want us to think now about John chapter 2 and the outstanding indicator Jesus gave that we call a sign of life. The wedding may have lasted some 7 days. It was not uncommon for a week-long gathering of people because it was so sacred, it was so special, it was so precious. And we see in the Gospels that Jesus enjoyed festivals and celebrations and joyful times with people. And the more we're like Jesus, the more we can appreciate those times of laughter and friendship, when we're not quite so serious about everything, but we can focus on a couple getting married and we can share in the reception and the time with them. You notice that Jesus' mother was there, and he was also invited with his disciples. This is the first time his disciples are mentioned as a group, and it's a reference to those who were named in John chapter 1. Simon Peter, Philip and Nathanael, Andrew, and the unnamed disciple, John 1:35. We think that's likely John the Apostle, the writer of this gospel. Jesus' mother, who's never called by name in John, seems to have something of a role of responsibility in this occasion. Because when the wine runs out, which I'm going to call whoa, she's the one that speaks up and comes to Jesus. They have no more wine. Why was this her word to speak? And so some have surmised, we don't know. Perhaps it was some sort of family gathering. It's fascinating in the Gospels, the things we're not told. Names, backgrounds, various details and particulars. We're very interested in these things. But the Gospels are focused with all the light on Jesus Christ, so that we might witness these signs, believe that He is the Son of God, and have life in His name. But for whatever reason, she comes to Jesus and brings to Him this crisis, a dilemma, which some have said would be quite embarrassing and shameful. Some have guessed there were more attendees than they had anticipated. That certainly could be the case, but for whatever reason. And Jesus' response to her is, "Woman." We're a little bit surprised by that. It was a common way of speaking in Jesus' time. It wasn't rude. It wasn't demeaning or disrespectful in any way, but it did put a polite distance. As Jesus noted, "My hour has not yet come." That reminds us that throughout the Gospel of John, there are continual references to the hour. And we keep reading, "Not yet, not yet, not yet." And then finally in John 12, around verse 20, Jesus says, "The hour has come." And He's about to go to be betrayed and arrested, crucified, and then brought back to life on the third day. But in Jesus' ministry, much of what He does in the early stages is quiet. It's behind the scenes. Even here, you noticed in the reading that not everyone was aware of where the beverage had come from, but those who drew the wine knew because they were part of it. And it wasn't necessarily broadcast, but His disciples became aware of it. And He manifested His glory, and they put their faith in Him. Look at verse 11. And that helps us see what primarily is going on here. We can say Jesus supported marriage and weddings. How many times there's been a ceremony where the preachers made a reference to John 2, and Jesus upheld the record of Genesis and one man and one woman. It's a time for feasting and celebration and joy. Or it might be noted Jesus' respect for His mother, because even though He said, "My hour's not yet come, why do you involve me? What does this have to do with me?" Then she next tells them, "You do whatever He tells you." And so there must be some understanding in His tone with her that He is going to respond. We could talk about Jesus being, in a sense, in subjection and honoring His mother. We know as a child He did so in Luke chapter 2. But the overarching theme in John 2, in this scene, and nothing must cloud this picture, is in verse 11, that He manifested His glory and His disciples believed in Him. Jesus had authority. And those water pots, which were ordinary, average, everyday, how many of those water pots might you have found throughout Galilee or the land of Israel when Jesus walked the earth? Would there have been hundreds, thousands? I love the way God takes what people use every day, and once He touches them, once He fills them, once He has control of them, He makes something amazing out of them. You know what He did with that bush and Moses in Exodus 3? You know what he did with that man's staff and Aaron's staff when they went before Pharaoh and when the Red Sea stood before the people of God. And you see on almost every page, it's a donkey. It's someone's house. In John 6, it's a little boy's lunch. And once it's put in the hand of Jesus, something happens. And certainly we're to see from this first sign of life that reality that Jesus can take what is old and stale, what is repetitive, what is tiresome, what just seems like we're running on that wheel, we're going around the bases, it's the same old, followed by the same old once again. And Jesus says, let me do something. You pour water into that pot under my direction, and then bring it out, and let's see what happens. There's another thing that stands out as I think about John chapter 2, and that is that Jesus involved everyday people in doing what was extraordinary. Not just objects like the pots, but the servants. What are their names? We don't know. All we're told is that they followed his direction. You and I. We don't have to be outstanding, famous, spectacular, unusual. Could we be the servants carrying the water pots? Think about this local mission effort yesterday and in the months ahead. Think about today at 4 o'clock, World Bible School. Kevin Kine back in room 33 helping us see how to go on the internet, which we love to do, and use it to take the message of Jesus to hungry, thirsty souls. And what could come out of their water pots when they find out what happens when Jesus touches ordinary things, ordinary people, ordinary circumstances? The whole passage tells me I want Jesus' influence in my marriage, in my house, with my children, in my relationships. And if I'm not going too far, let me look through the things that are in my pockets, that I have some ownership of, and think of them as water pots. What could Jesus do with that car I thought was mine? With that house he lets me live in? With the time he allots me today and this week? Boy, those water pots. That's really something to think about, isn't it? When they drew it out, it wasn't just wine. It was the best wine. And I wonder how many similar occasions that head waiter had served, and how many times he had tasted that which was about to be given to the guests. And once again, we would assume from what we know of Jesus and what the Bible teaches and what we see from history, it was some kind of diluted beverage that could not possibly intoxicate. And while we're talking about that, have you been listening to all the strong conversation this week about the Supreme Court nomination? I want to talk about that tonight. Sticks and stones, the power of words. But I found something that President Trump said that I can quote. Yes. You know what he said that I can quote, and you can too? I never had a beer. Isn't that great? Did you hear him say that? And then he said something else. He said, can you imagine what a mess I'd be if I had? Yeah, maybe some people can. Did you realize that all of this mess we've been through, how much of it would not have even been a discussion if the people involved had not been involved in drinking? Do you realize if there hadn't been intoxication and drunkenness, that people would have been sober and alert? Everybody would have remembered exactly where they were and what they did. Thank you, President Trump. And so the head waiter didn't know, but the servants knew. Now, why did the servants know? Because they experienced it. Maybe there's something for us here, too. Is there a difference between knowing about Jesus and knowing Jesus? Walking with Jesus? Learning to think like he does? Putting myself there, and I'm that servant. And Lord, here's the water pot, and I'm giving it to you. Let's see what you'll do with it. And because of that, there's something that happens in my life. Now, how's the head waiter going to learn about it? We're not told. I liked what Richard Lyons said in his prayer this morning. The whole prayer, of course, but that people who know us might see that we're different. I wonder how those servants became different people because of what happened that day. And then in verse 10, there's the wonder. This is where he said, every man serves the good wine first. And then when people have drunk freely, again, that phrase does not necessarily mean that people were drunk, but they've had a lot of this diluted beverage, let's say, to drink. That was common. Then he serves the poorer, but you've kept the good wine until now. So it's the question, how did he do that? What happened? Isn't it intriguing to think that someone in your life might recognize in you the touch of the Master's hand and say, how'd that happen? Where has that person been? I thought I knew him or her, and now there's something different. The Gospel of John doesn't tell us how the head waiter's surprise or how the mystery was ever solved, if it was. What happens next? Well, in verse 12, notice again, this is now a company. He and his mother and his brothers and his disciples. Very interesting about the brothers, the half-brothers of Jesus, most likely. We'll see later in John 7 that they came to where they did not believe in him because they were resistant to the affirmation that he was the Christ, the Son of God. Perhaps they'd not been part of all that had happened at that wedding scene. But at any rate, Capernaum becomes the new spot where Jesus starts his ministry and goes out from there. Then, what about the rest of the chapter? And this is one of those fascinating things. As you study inductively, that is, as you look at the text and you try to ask the questions and find the answers and see what emerges from the text, is it a coincidence that Jesus turned the water to wine and then he went to Jerusalem and cleansed the temple? I don't mean coincidence. It's just this happened and then separately. That's what I meant to say. It's just a separate thing that next he did this. Or are both events intended to convey this message? The practice in the temple, tired, worn out, stale, repetitive, missing the mark, missing the whole point. Could that be what was going on with those water pots? Fill them, empty them. Fill them, empty them. Fill them, empty them. Why? Well, it's just something we do. We just go through these outward motions. Is that what's going on in the temple? We're not told, but part of our Bible study helps us to ask those questions and at least consider that possibility. What we do know for sure, as we noted when we began, is that this first sign points toward the thesis of the whole inspired book. These signs are written. This is the first sign. Why are they written? That you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. What will happen then? Through that faith, you can have life. Signs of life. Now look at John 2:11. What is the overarching point or aim or result of what Jesus did? Jesus manifested his glory. And his disciples believed in him. If you were to go back to John chapter 1, No one's ever seen God, but God, the only Son, the Word became flesh, and we beheld His glory. And so in John 2, John begins to tell us by inspiration how Jesus started shining the light of who He really is. And the disciples caught it. They recognized it. And they trusted Him because of it. One final thought. John 20, 30, and 31. These signs are written so the world may believe, yes, and have life. So your neighbor may believe, yes. So everyone, yes. But John 20 says these things are written so that you might believe and have life. So I want to ask today, what if you had been at that wedding? What if you had seen and felt and heard and experienced what they did? What if you had been told, as Jesus' mother said, do whatever He tells you to do? Let me ask you, are you ready to do whatever Jesus tells you to do? Are you ready to take those water pots that you have and bring them to Him and see what He's going to do about it? What if you'd poured the water? What if you'd drawn it out and tasted it? What if you had witnessed His glory? What would you do? What will you do? Signs of life. This is the first one. And it begins a process of unveiling of the majesty and the beauty and the wonder and the greatness of Jesus Christ. So the invitation might be, whether publicly or privately, to bring Him your water pot, to take what's ordinary and stale and worn out and old and broken in your life, what's become routine and shallow, maybe even some outward observances that need fresh energy, and let Jesus take what's put in them and transform it into something fresh and invigorating and precious. As we note each time we meet, that step of being immersed into Jesus Christ for the forgiveness of sins, that baptism into His death and burial and resurrection, that's something like that water pot change. And then keeping our faith and continuing to freshen it and revitalize it in prayer and fellowship. You're welcome to come. You're encouraged to come as we stand and sing.